Hi and welcome. I see a lot of guests already here and trickling in, so we'll give you a couple more minutes as well. But in the meantime, I will introduce myself. My name is Elise Hu. I am a host at NPR and also the host of the TED podcast, TED Talks Daily. Thank you guys so much for being here on behalf of Microsoft and the San Francisco Council and Brookings Institution. I'm going to be emceeing and kind of driving this conversation today, but we have a really exciting presentation, I think, that's going to really form the foundation of our panel discussion today from Brookings Institution. So I'm really looking forward to that and to hearing from you. So just to get things started, we have a couple housekeeping notes to mention. This event is being recorded. You might be able to see that from the platform already. If you are on camera right now, go ahead and turn off your camera for us, please. Just because, as you know from being on a bunch of Zoom calls during this pandemic, it kind of stresses out bandwidth to have a bunch of us on camera. So please go ahead and turn off your camera. And everyone, from what I can tell in my earbuds, is already doing a really good job of keeping your microphones on mute. There is a chat window, a panel that will open up for you where we want to hear from you. We want to hear your questions because we are reserving the end of our panel time to a Q&A, and hopefully it will be a lively one where I will ask your questions aloud to our panel. And if you have a question for a specific panelist, I ask that you, when you're typing your message with your question in it, go ahead and note this is for all or for everyone, or it's for a specific panelist. So that kind of handles the housekeeping. Without further ado, I want to introduce our host with the most, Celeste, Alleyne, Microsoft. She has brought all of us together today. She is Los Angeles based and the Director of Citizenship and Market Development. Celeste.
Well, thank you, Elise, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's Microsoft and Brookings conversation about workforce skilling and the challenges preparing for career opportunities in the San Francisco area. Today, we will hear from experts describing the local work landscape in the Bay Area as we continue to navigate a new normal during a pandemic. We will also hope to unpack some of the critical barriers to the ever-widening digital divide and pathways to employment. In today's audience, we have members from many communities, including state and local government and education leaders, nonprofit and philanthropy professionals, private sector community members, and workforce development specialists. We're so glad you could join us today. And I'd also like to thank our esteemed event moderator, Elise Hu. She's become a good friend to Microsoft, and she's from National Public Radio. We should expect a riveting conversation with our speakers, panelists, and audience. And now, I'd like to introduce my friend and our host for today, the President and CEO of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Rodney Fong. Rodney?
Thank you, Celeste. Really appreciate it and so much appreciate this partnership with Microsoft and the Brookings Institution. Rodney Fong, President and CEO of the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce, and my job is to really welcome you and set a little bit of stage for the discussion, the long discussion that we really are facing here in San Francisco and other major cities. COVID-19 has had tremendous impact on businesses of all sizes, big and small, and nonprofits here in San Francisco. Currently, San Francisco is looking at a 230,000 unemployment claims in the city itself. That is a tremendous number. Many of these unemployment claims are coming from the hospitality industry, as San Francisco is a service and just focused city. So the real question is, what is the work in the future going to be? How do we activate talent? Some of these are short-term, immediate jobs that need to be replaced, but many of them are long-term career paths that are going to be very different as we've all pivoted and gone online. So these are the big questions that are in front of us. This particular panel is a great grouping to begin that discussion of how we upskill people, how we take people from various positions in the hospitality world and lead them to potentially tech jobs, lead them to potentially AI jobs. How do we create and connect academia with the business sector as well so that academia can prepare itself and call out the types of curriculum that we need to employ people down the road. So again, everyone for participating in this. The Chamber of Commerce is very interested in trying to solve these questions, these problems, and ask questions by getting there, and really trying to make sure that we have a very equitable city, both in San Francisco, but around the United States. So thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it back to Elise Hu.
Thank you so much, Rodney. And you did an awesome job really laying the groundwork for our conversation today. And just so you all know, we're going to have we're about to hear from Brookings, but afterwards we're also going to hear from the Microsoft Global Skilling Initiative, and then we're going to jump into the panel. So I just want to sort of roadmap for you what's coming up. Next, we have Annelies Goger from Brookings. She is an economic geographer looking at new policy solutions around skilling, internships, and education. So she's perfect for this discussion. She focuses on workforce development, supply chains, and the impact of technology. And her research that she's about to present is going to form a real foundation for the rest of our conversation today. So Annelies, welcome.
Thank you. And it's really a pleasure to be here. I'm a Rubenstein Fellow in the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program. And I moved to DC from the Bay Area. So it's a special pleasure because I know many of you watching today and have worked with you in the past. And so it's really wonderful to be invited to give this talk. Trying to go back. So I wanted to give a talk today about skilling in this salon, but I think as we know, before the pandemic, we were talking about the future of work and the fact that it may lead to a lot of inequality because of the disproportionate impact it would have on low-wage workers and workers typically who do routine tasks. And now that we have the pandemic, what used to be, something we were worried about in 10 or 15 years has suddenly hit us all at once and very rapidly. So I want to make a few points pretty quickly about this recession to kind of set the context. So first of all, that this COVID recession is a lot worse than previous cyclical recessions overall, but also the COVID recession is like a tale of two pandemics. So people who are able to work from home generally tend to be more likely to be higher wage earners or middle wage earners. Whereas the scenario for lower wage earners who are earning less than $16 an hour is a lot more dire. And what this also means is that because there's a lot of occupational segregation in those low wage occupations, such as hospitality and leisure, that also means that because women are over-concentrated in those fields and people of color, that this pandemic is amplifying and exacerbating existing inequalities that we had. And so truly, it's the future of work is already here. So as I mentioned, leisure and hospitality is one of the sectors that's most impacted. I've been writing a lot about this with my colleague Tracy Haddon-Lowe. And one of the things I want to just highlight here is that I used to work in the hospitality industry when I was in high school and college. A lot of people use this industry as a stepping stone into their career, that first job, or let's say they're taking some time to either take care of a family member, raise kids, and they can't be working full time. They might do a hospitality job. So it's not just that these careers are disrupted, although for many in this sector, it is a career, but also that there's a wide range of ways that people use these jobs, and that is going away. And it's a really valuable thing for a lot of people to deal with different uncertainties and things that come up in their lives, and that's pretty concerning in the long run. Another point I want to make is that young people are disproportionately affected and not equally by race and gender. So the orange here are people 16 to 25 or 24, and the blue is people who are over 25. So you're seeing unemployment rates that are much, much higher for youth. And that's really troubling based on what we know from previous recessions, because once young people get disconnected from their career path, it can be very costly and difficult and challenging to get them back on it. And what it translates into many times, unless you can reconnect people quickly, is long-term earnings loss, and that's very troubling for me. That's one of the things that keeps me up at night. So zooming into the Bay Area, I wanted to highlight some things that I've been working on. So Luther Jackson is one of my colleagues that I wrote a piece with recently, and I'll go into that a bit later. But we've been working with a few different regions that have been severely affected by this pandemic. And one of them is the Bay Area. So these are some graphs of business openings. In the bottom is San Francisco, and then Oakland and San Jose. And here's a graph. I could only get data up to June, but here's a graph of employment among restaurant and hotel workers. So you're not seeing, at least until June, a lot of recovery in those jobs. A lot of these jobs are not going to come back. And so that means you're not just trying to get another job, you're trying to transition into an entirely different culture of work, entirely different career network. And so that does mean skills, but it also means a lot more. So in short, I want to say that the future is now, and it's not just about skills. So Luther and I wrote a piece called "The Labor Market Doesn't Have a Skills Gap, It Has an Opportunity Gap," because what we believe is that we need to step back in this crisis because of all the previous structural disadvantages that people have already had. And then you add on to that the uneven effects of the pandemic. We need to really redesign and rethink how we support career transitions, much more broadly than simply with skills, but actually addressing some of those barriers in labor market reallocation. So it's a reallocation problem. You got to switch careers. It's not just what do you know, it's also who you know. So what do I mean? What do we mean by shifting the narrative? Well, first of all, when you talk about a skills gap, it's really about what an individual lacks. It's a deficit thinking narrative that actually, if you think about it, and the histories of racial segregation, the histories of gender wage disparities, these are structural issues that have been around for a very long time, but individual for lacking something. Instead of alternatively reframing the narrative around, well, what can this individual bring to the table? Everyone has interests, passions, abilities, talent. What are the things that we can actually build on? What is the ecosystem that we can leverage to help support that individual get where they're trying to go and understand what their options are and how to get there? And then how can we, make sure that we're activating and not just sort of wasting the opportunity to connect with talent? Secondly, that this is not about charity. So why are we doing this connectivity between hospitality workers and, healthcare careers or construction careers, like career transition? Not because we are trying to save people that we need to kind of do this out of giving back to the community, but rather, if we do not do this, we will not be able to leverage the talent that we do have to innovate and to keep up to pace with the pace of rapid innovation that's happening in the future of work. So the future of work has not gone away. Technologies are changing, not in the tech industry, but in healthcare with telehealth, and that's been going even faster now with the pandemic. And that's happening in every industry. To the extent that we cannot activate the talent that we have effectively and address some of these affordability and childcare and transportation barriers and other barriers, we're holding everything back. And so this has got to be about career mobility for everyone and kind of having within the workplace more opportunities to learn. And it starts with how do you get into those fields? I'm sure we'll talk about that later in the discussion. So in our piece, we talked about the existing public systems we have now for funding skills training. And what my research intern, Janie, and I noticed was that many of these top occupations that we're training people for, they are one-off trainings that are very short-term and very small amounts, because we don't give a lot of funding for workforce training. If you have a child that you're going to send to college, you might be told you should save $200,000, $300,000 to send that person to college, right? But in workforce, we're spending about, on average, around $2,000 a participant on training for those who are lucky enough to get training, which is actually very few. As you can see, these are national numbers from 2016 to 2018. So very small people are getting them for very small amounts in a one-off way, and they're leading to very, very low wages, with the exception of registered nurses in this list. So we need to rethink our policy, because this kind of one-off small dosage training isn't going to solve these structural problems with equity that this COVID pandemic has worsened. And one of the reasons, so this is all coming from the piece that Luther from NovaWorks and I did, but one of the things that brought us to write this piece is that we did a project with Tech Hire Oakland at the Capers Center, where they were hosting a event with LinkedIn and Twilio to have underrepresented talent who work at LinkedIn, who had gotten there through non-traditional pathways, to give talks to small groups of talent that were from the local community that were trying to break into tech. And we interviewed them about what were their pain points in trying to get into these quality tech jobs. And the things that they mentioned had nothing to do with most of what our policy is focusing on, which are these short-term trainings and skills. Most of what they told us had to do with feeling like an outsider and not knowing, what's the landscape of what are my options? If I might know that someone can do user experience, but beyond that, I don't really know what are the different paths. How much can I make in this occupation versus that? Secondly, they didn't know how to connect with people that were already in the field face-to-face to act as role models or mentors, or give them information, valuable information about, okay, if you want to go into cloud computing, here's the training program that you need to take. So everybody can take a training program, but if it's not the right one, then you're kind of wasting your time and your money. And so this access to information about what to do to get into a specific field, it requires professional networks. And then finally, all the unwritten rules that go along with getting into a field and how to market yourself to a specific employer, all of that requires knowing. And so that not any of these things are really explicitly addressed in our workforce policy right now, and that needs to change. So backing back out to the future of work now, where everything is now shifting online, and there's digital divide problems that have exacerbated people's access to information and resources. So this is getting worse. And I think that one thing that we can do is think about ways that we can integrate learning into every aspect of work much more carefully. So we need to rethink how we do this traditional path of first you go to college or education, then you work, and that's it, you're done learning, to now that we know that the economy is changing rapidly and we have all these equity issues where college is very unaffordable, how do we build work cultures where people are continuously learning? So I will just close it off. I'm very eagerly waiting this conversation by just kind of thinking through what I think are some things that employers and talent development organizations can be thinking about to actually implement a policy where they're changing that narrative. So for employers, it means changing where what is the pool that you're fishing for talent from? If you're only going to the graduating class of the top 20 computer science programs in the country and you're competing with your competitors to poach talent, that's a very elite small pool to pick from. So some employers like Twilio have started apprenticeship programs and that are using that as an alternate pipeline of recruiting to get talent who normally wouldn't be entering their pipeline. And then there are other aspects around how do you pick talent. So often there's a tendency for employers to pick people that are just like the existing people, because that seems less risky. But actually, innovation requires that people look at the same problem from very different angles, and the best way to do that is to have a team that comes from diverse backgrounds. So that can mean racial, gender, age backgrounds. It can also mean, I was an English major and then I decided to get into technology. This is an example of technology, of course, but this can go for really any occupation. How do you diversify the criteria. Make sure that your criteria aren't just reproducing the same, more of the same. And then finally, once somebody gets to an organization, what we heard from employers that had been trying to diversify their teams is that what they learned is they had to do more training of their managers on how to manage diverse teams. And then talent development organizations, I know we have to get moving, so I'm going to try to go quickly. Not just funneling people. So what happens typically in a job center is someone will come in and we'll say, okay, which box are you in? Are you a veteran? Are you a person with a disability? And we have a set of options predefined based on the barrier that you have. So we're defining people by their barriers instead of listening to what that person already has and what they want to do and how you can help support that transition. So I think we need to create a larger menu of options and human-centered design to incorporate people's feedback into that process to understand their pain points and what are they really struggling with, whether they're an employer or a job seeker. And then emphasizing more the professional networks, the upfront process of meeting people in that industry, getting information that's very specific to those roles, and really building people's personal networks and face-to-face interactions. And then finally, in this pandemic, we have to remember that if somebody doesn't have childcare, it's going to be really hard for them to get a job or to learn or to do really anything. So we have to be thinking about what is it beyond skills alone that people need to be successful, and how can we make those things happen more smoothly and not keep having to bounce people from one service provider to the next. Because people tend to get pretty frustrated when they're passed back and forth between different silos. So with that, I will turn it back over to Elise.
Thank you so much, Annelies. And it's a shame we're not all in the same room together, because we would give you a huge round of applause. I heard so much good stuff there. And especially this idea that it's not a skills gap, it's an opportunity gap. And that we're in this reallocation problem. And I love thinking about the pipeline and thinking about hiring in terms of what people can bring to the table instead of what the employer or the hiring person is looking for. So to dovetail into that, now we are going to bring on Allyson Knox, who is a senior director at Microsoft Philanthropies, and she works really closely with the Microsoft Global Skilling Initiative, which is asking a lot of these questions that Annelies Goger just brought up. So, Allyson, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, and good morning to everyone. Elise, thanks for hosting, and Annelies, great presentation, and San Francisco Chamber, thank you so much for having Microsoft. I can't agree more with Annelies in terms of needing to find those lost Einsteins in our economy and bringing more opportunities to folks, especially during this unprecedented year where not only do we all personally face so many different new kinds of challenges, but we're also realizing we're not going to go back to the same economy that we once had. And truthfully, I think we're all experiencing how the global health crisis is truly an economic crisis. And when we're returning to this economy, that the jobs are going to look different. And for those who are vulnerable, as Annelies said, and we're facing already some of the problems around globalization and automation, COVID has just now exacerbated all of those issues. And so we really need to be thinking how we stand with folks to find that asset building way to provide people opportunities in this new economy. It's intensified this existing skilling challenge, both for employers and for employees, as we go out to sort of cultivate the new talent of today and tomorrow. I want to put a fine point before I go into the Microsoft Skills Initiative of the fact that within sort of this economic crisis and then this workforce crisis, this opportunity crisis, but then really look at how businesses and employers are looking for those with digital literacies. So just to give some examples of how much I think we're all seeing change with the need for digital literacy, more and more people will say, I'm not sure, Allyson, what you specifically mean when a person who works at a warehouse needs digital skills. Make that case. And so I have an image from the National Skills Coalition, who we partner with quite a bit, of someone in a warehouse using a mobile device. And to Annelise's point of people not feeling at home in the technology context, sometimes they also don't feel at home with just learning how to move, retail inventory on a new kind of remote device that they now have to use. So how do we help people realize that they can learn those skills, and those are considered digital skills? The voice assistant expanding in the elder care field. It's another example of how health home aides are thinking, gosh, I never really knew I was going to have to be a technical support person for an elderly person who's trying to get in contact with their doctor. But that's sort of a new set of skills that are almost becoming, in some cases, assumed. So those are some examples of some of the digital literacies people are looking for by sector. And again, just to put another quick fine point, and knowing that San Francisco is facing such a demand in hospitality and a shift of folks to gain those digital skills, PIAC does a particular assessment of adults every 4 years. Happy to share details about that later. Again, the National Skills Coalition really drills into the digital skills piece. And if you see the no digital skills line, which is green, then blue is the digital skills with limited skills. So those folks, for example, who have a hard time copying and pasting a sentence and then putting it in a new document, that would be limited digital skills. No digital skills would be a person who would struggle to understand if you said, put this on a USB drive. So a combined percentage of workers per these industries, I just find really a wake-up call for all of us to realize that we need to find opportunities for folks to gain digital skills. So hospitality, 36% nationwide. But if you look also at manufacturing, 35%. And then, the highest is in construction, and there are other breakouts as well. So how does Microsoft approach this massive goal? We made this massive issue. We put a stake in the ground and said we have a huge goal worldwide, which is to equip 25 million job seekers with these digital skills. And we brought 3 parts of our company together to do this. And this is a flywheel we designed. The big point here is that we're really designing these things with the job seeker in mind. We're making sure that the content that LinkedIn Learning offered previously for a price, now we've unlocked that content. Certifications for Microsoft have radically been discounted. And then we're also helping provide training online that helps people compete for jobs in this new economy. So let's just take a quick look. I love how the entire offer has a entry point for anyone. So let's say you want to learn about how to use a mouse, or you want to learn how to use that USB drive. We have a basic digital literacy set of courses. If, let's say, you're thinking, I want to upskill my current skills with productivity tools, and it doesn't just have to be Microsoft tools. I want to learn how to program better in Excel, or begin to use Excel in a different way. We have those kinds of skills. And then we also have technical skills, as well as those certifications. So let's just take a look at the digital literacy course just for a moment. Here's the instructor. You can join in a community. You can click on the instructor and communicate with them. Again, walking you through some of the basics of how to use technology and how to think about it also on your job. And then these in-demand 10 learning paths that we've identified through LinkedIn data. So we quantified the in-demand component of these 10 learning paths. Each of the paths has separate courses. When you finish, you get a badge automatically onto your LinkedIn page. And then you can see I've outlined 3 of them in particular. They're having the biggest rate of acceleration in the actual tech sector. So data analyst, IT administrator, and software developer. We know for sure we can't do this alone. We have to work with nonprofits who can provide those supports, the coaching, the connectivity that Annelies talked about, the relationships, so many of the things on the ground that we just don't have the kind of presence in every single local community that we'd like to do the work. So we partner with nonprofits through grants, and then also, of course, with government. And one example of our grants program is our recent community skills program, where we're investing $15 million in over 3 years to accelerate the work of 50 Black and African American led nonprofits who are doing this digital skilling work. And we're really pleased that these 3-year operating grants of $100,000 per year These are just, again, operating grants. We're not saying they have to go to programmatic purposes. So we had an incredible turnout for those nonprofits across the country who wanted to be part of this pool. We had over 1,300 nonprofits apply. We're going to be awarding to 50, but the rest of the folks, the rest of the nonprofits will be going into a specialized program so that we can focus on leadership development and opportunity development in those local communities. With government, I only have a couple more slides just to let you know. In government, we are advocating and using our voice to talk about how there needs to be more investment in individuals to attain key digital skills. And we're also putting innovation and data to work in new ways to help inform those public systems to be more updated, more shooting for jobs, and providing training and prediction for the jobs of the future. We also want you to know that we want to be supportive in California. We know that Governor Newsom has this Future of Work Commission, and I think his recommendations, their recommendations are coming out now or will be coming out in the next couple of weeks. And we want to be as helpful in California and San Francisco as possible with local lawmakers, local leaders who are trying to figure out new and innovative ways to bring opportunities to more people. And so we just really believe we have to do this all together. We all know that we're in this sort of new economy trying to figure it out. Microsoft believes one of our greatest assets is our ability to focus in on the digital skill needs and making sure that we are providing those opportunities to as many people around the world to get the training that they need to achieve as possible. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Elise and just want to say special thanks to everybody who made this possible.
Allyson, thank you. And thank you for your presentation. And before I let you go completely and have you mute yourself, there is one really practical question, which is where can people find these trainings?
Yeah, so I'll put it in the chat window. It's opportunity.linkedin.com.
Okay, fantastic. Opportunity.linkedin.com if you are interested. And thank you again to Allyson. All right, so now I get to bring in our panel, and we have an awesome panel that's been curated for you today. And we will talk as a panel kind of amongst ourselves, in which I will kind of pitch questions to the panelists until about 10 after 11 o'clock Pacific. And at 10 after, we're gonna switch over to asking the questions from you. So just a reminder for those of you who are in our audience, there is a chat panel window. Please type your question in that panel window and you can direct it to a specific speaker or just for any of the panelists. On our panel today are going to be Allyson from Microsoft and Annelies from Brookings. But also you'll see we've got Orlando Harris, who is based in San Francisco, and he is the Executive Director for Career Services and Leadership Development at San Francisco State University. And then we have William Rogers, who is the president and CEO of the Goodwill of San Francisco, of Goodwill of San Francisco. And Goodwill, as you all probably know, really focuses on hiring and employing a lot of vulnerable Californians and helping them build digital skills along with Microsoft. So it is perfect to have William on the panel. And finally, we have Tom Lawry, who is the National Director for AI and Health and Life Sciences. So he's going to talk a little bit about how AI is going to be leveraged as we head into this historic transformation of how we work. So welcome to the panel. Hi, everybody. Is everyone unmuted? Okay, Annelies, good morning. Thanks everybody for being here. And I look forward to having a lively discussion. One thing, just a message to you panelists, if one person is, if one of your fellow panelists says something that then kind of sparks an idea, please don't wait for me to kind of say, hey, you can have the mic. So if you want to jump in because Annelies has said something so compelling, please just unmute yourself and jump in, because I want this to be a lot more of a conversation rather than some sort of like hosted radio show where I'm kind of directing you very specifically. So, but Annelies, because your presentation really laid the groundwork, there is kind of a current events question that I want to get at with you, which is this new administration, or if Trump leaves office, a new administration and policy change, right? So the question for you is kind of what role government or policymaking can play in addressing some of these equity issues that have been exacerbated by the COVID pandemic and recession? Why don't we start there, and then hopefully that'll drive some more of the conversations about pipeline and skill building.
Great question. Yeah, so I think that right now the issue is that our policy is more of a one-off and small intervention. Get someone into a job, get them a short training, and let them go, and then disappear. And I think what we need to do with policy is move from that kind of siloed, if you qualify, if you meet these eligibility requirements and you qualify for this silo over here, and then we pass people between these silos. I think what we need to do is use human-centered design to really think about that journey of the job seeker, or even of the employer, and make sure that that person's user experience, like to use a tech word, is smooth, and they're not getting, really frustrated trying to figure out where they can go for some help. And so I think that we need to do a lot more thinking around whether it's unemployment insurance, as we all seen how hard it's been for people to navigate that, but also just, career information, or, how do I find fellowships? This is my goal. How do I get there? And number two, I think, and this is kind of related, but I think we need to make career navigation much more universally available. So we all know that when we have children and we want to send them to school, we send them for an education, we take them to a K-12 school. But we don't have the same awareness or, a go-to place for when you need help with your career. You go to these, we actually do have a network of national job centers, but a lot of people don't know they exist. Or people go to the libraries or their community colleges, or they go into these other places. And I think we need a there. We need to kind of centralize like the where do you go, and that everyone can get that access to one-on-one career help when they need it, and get linked into very specific, industry-specific, occupational-specific advice. That person can link them up with those folks. And then thirdly, I'm kind of touched on this a little bit with my presentation, but I think that the dual challenges of the COVID recovery equity problems and future of work is that we need to move away from siloing off, college education paths and work paths, where you kind of do one but not the other, and really have a blended experience where we have workplace cultures that incentivize learning, where we have deeper partnerships and around things like apprenticeships and internships to give, one of the things when you're applying for a new job is you have to have that first work experience. Somebody has to be willing to take a bet on you in a new industry to give you that first experience. And we need that type of partnership between employers and talent development programs and organizations to provide those experiences. And through those experiences, you not only gain skills, but hopefully you can get linked to related instruction. And I think there's some potential that, tools like the ones that Allyson presented could be used in tandem with work experience to generate learning over time.
I just wanted to make two quick points. One is just as a great example of what Annelies was talking about in terms of individual sort of learning accounts that follow you from employer to employer. In France, they think of training as an individual right, and it's actually a law that folks can contribute to. You can contribute to it, your employer can contribute to it, the government can contribute to it, but wherever you go, you have a fund and it goes with you. But the concept of it as a right is such a cultural shift, I think, then from what Annelies was saying. We don't even know where to go get the training sometimes, let alone thinking about it as a right. And then secondly, I just wanted you to know that I think the technology sector, we are trying so hard to figure out great ways to do apprenticeship programs. We have one called the LEAP program at Microsoft, and we're part of a cluster of technology companies up in the Seattle region called Apprenti. But I really believe that there's a lot of work employers can do to just make sure that everybody has an opportunity through a work-based learning program to gain the skills they need. So I'll go on mute.
Annelies, you mentioned taking bets on folks, and so this actually makes me think of William Rogers and your work at Goodwill. You all do take a lot of bets on folks who may not have had that first experience that Annelies talks about. So what have you learned as you work with employees like this, or potential employees like this?
Yeah, thank you. You know, a lot of what people don't know about Goodwill is that the only reason we exist is to hire people who are otherwise difficult to employ. So folks who are formerly incarcerated, folks who have low skill or low education levels. And when we talk about equity, we're talking about folks who fundamentally can't find work and don't have opportunity because in many cases they don't have work histories, or they're returning from incarceration or military service, or they've even been living on the streets. And so for us to make equity a reality, not just a talking point, I absolutely agree that work-based employment and training opportunities are critical. So part of what we're doing at Goodwill is we're saying, okay, you were formerly incarcerated. We know that 99% of the employers will not hire you, but we're going to hire you and we're going to train you. And so we have sort of an earn while you learn program, because it's very hard for folks to be able to say, okay, well, I'm going to go do workforce education over here, but I still have to figure out how to support myself. So I'm going to somehow do that after I've worked 60 hours a week. So we incorporate all of that into one setting, so that you're getting job training, you're getting employment with benefits. And that employment is important because if you don't have a work history, or if you have a scattered work history, you need that paid employment, not volunteer employment, but paid employment in order to get another job. You also, if you just get a certification, but you have no work experience, you're not going to get hired down the road. So all of those things are really important. I think the other thing that I want to say about sort of the larger systems issue, because there's the workforce sort of ecosystem, but this also goes beyond that. So I want to give an example of what is commonly known as the benefits cliff. So we have a lot of folks in Goodwill, and we hire about 600 people every year who are low or no income. Everybody who comes to us, 95% of the folks who come to us are low or no income. And so what happens is somebody does a really good job, and we're like, you know what, we are going to give you a raise, and we are going to elevate you to the next level. And what we get is, sorry, can't do that. And they can't do that because in many cases, what folks have is they have housing subsidies. And so in pre-COVID, you have a two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco was about $54,000 a year. And so that means you got to earn about $70,000 a year in order to pay for that two-bedroom apartment. If I'm somebody who's extremely low income and I decide, I get told that I'm going to get $12,000 more a year, am I going to give up a $70,000 pre-tax benefit for $12,000 more a year? The answer is no. So I think that what we do is we tend to situate the problem with the individual, and we say, well, they're not motivated or et cetera, but we have systems in place that actually de-incentivize and make it extraordinarily difficult for people to actually move forward.
I actually wanted to add something to that, if you don't mind, from a higher ed standpoint. One of the things when I talk to students, I always told them, when you look at opportunities, don't self-deselect, meaning don't just look at that opportunity in a box and say, I'm not qualified for it. But also say to our employer and partners that we work with that I would prefer they didn't, self-deselect our students either. Because what you find is that so many employers, especially in the Bay Area, tend to look at what we call a stack pile. One stack pile says that these are the universities that we're looking at. And when you look at San Francisco State University, for instance, we hear a lot about diversity today, right? And San Francisco State University has been recognized as one of the top 5 diverse campuses in the country. And so what we are trying to do is also encourage employers to look outside of their box, to change their agenda, to look at those universities where they may not have been designated to look, in the past. And I would add to that a couple of years ago, I was fortunate enough to have Amit Singh on campus and from Google, and we did a roundtable. And one of the things that Google had done was they had just completed at that time a 3-year study within Google. And what they did, they looked at progression in the company, coming in from the very beginning, progression within the company and the university from which that person graduated. And what Google found was that there was no direct correlation to the university and the success within Google. San Francisco State, of course, we have employees or alums who are employed there, and they were part of that survey. And so I say to employers, as we look at where the next opportunities exist to open, their kind of preview of what they're looking at.
Yeah, this sounds like it's really echoing a lot of what Annelies talked about, which is not only is there real inequity in hiring because we tend to hire what we know or hire what we think we are familiar with or think we're looking for. We're hiring for in kind of the inverse model, which is what does this student bring to the table or what does this potential employee bring to the table? There's also some inequity in like how these hiring managers are thinking about where people graduated even, or whether they even went to college or a technical school. So on this equity question, why don't I bring in Tom Lawry now to ask Tom how AI might be able to be leveraged and to sort of address a lot of these inequities that we're seeing that already existed systemically, but now are getting exacerbated by the pandemic and the recession.
Great question. So I'd frame that by saying, think about your own world where everything is becoming more mobile and intelligent thanks to the cloud and artificial intelligence. So, you probably don't even think about all the things you do with that smartphone in the course of your day to make life better and easier, work, personal, kids. So that's just going to continue. So it really is a matter of looking at how we help. Annelies talked about the opportunity gap. And the challenge with this is, I think the gap or chasm will actually widen because of AI initially. And the real challenge is, what do we do to bring people forward into how to cross that digital divide? San Francisco, we some of us were discussing this earlier, it really is a tale of two cities. You are one of the world headquarters for the top talent driving all of this. And at the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, you have more and more people becoming marginalized because they don't have the skills, they don't have access to a lot of the things that Allyson was talking about. Beyond that, what I'd say is, once COVID is beyond us, and eventually we will, who knows when that will be, what the new normal will look like. But once that happens, there's still going to be a great challenge in how AI impacts the workforce and the job opportunities. A study by McKinsey says in the next 10 years, 30% of all work done by humans will be done by AI and intelligent machines. So when we play that out, much of that looks like automation of jobs that are typically highly repetitive with low skills needed. So a great example is this week, the Los Angeles Daily News had an article about how workers at Kaiser Permanente were protesting in 7 locations because of the introduction of robotic vacuum systems. And essentially, it's a good example of how the ability to automate a highly repetitive activity is going to take place. I'd flip that around and say the challenge is, how do we start looking at skilling initiatives to bring people along on all of the things Allyson talked about, and even beyond the technical skilling of looking at all of the people who are in repetitive activity jobs now that really do have the faculties and capabilities to do things like reason, judgment, creativity, which are all the skills and the capabilities, what we would call a knowledge worker, which will only grow as far as their importance and their need to be in the workforce.
Fantastic. Annelies, you kind of talked about this and have been talking about this throughout, but given these realities of the changing workforce, technically, how should employers be changing their practices to address not only structural and systemic change, but also digital change?
Yeah, so yeah, I did hit on this a bit in my talk, and Orlando and William also kind of pointed out some really key pieces of this too. So I think overall, it's being self-reflective about your own hiring process and recruitment process, and not situating the process, like not looking at the candidate as an individual and saying you lack something. I'm going to look elsewhere. But more like, well, what am I doing? What am I doing myself that might be reproducing this outcome? And why are people leaving? Even though I recruit people of color, they're leaving. Why? Doing that work and training managers. I've found a lot of my interviews with employers that in the U.S. versus some other countries, we're very short-term oriented. So we tend to see training and learning as a cost instead of as an investment. I think we need to, if the future of work requires people to keep up with changes in more rapid cycles, I think what that means is that the entire culture of learning has to be in place in every organization, or you won't really be able to deploy any of these new technologies that are coming out. And I think apprenticeship is one way to start to really set up that internal learning infrastructure. In California, actually, they have also the employment training panel, which helps employers get reimbursed for their training efforts. And so they can, the state is trying to incentivize employers to make these structural investments, especially middle-sized companies that are growing really fast. Often they don't have that internal learning infrastructure. And taking on and setting up an apprenticeship program can not only benefit the apprentices, but actually what we hear is that it benefits the mentors that are engaging in it. It benefits the whole team because it creates this sort of learning culture. And so I will kind of do a shout out to a few folks in the Bay Area who are doing this work. Tech SF in San Francisco, but also the Bay Area Apprenticeship Coalition also is a regional effort to scale up apprenticeship, is one resource that you could reach out to learn more. But also I co-founded a meetup group called Apprenticeship that meets monthly virtually now during the pandemic. And I'm still trying to participate virtually, but really the leadership has been taken over by folks from JVS, NovaWorks, and San Francisco's workforce boards. And I can put the link in the chat if folks want to. It's really open to anyone, whether you're a job seeker, an educator, an employer, and it's really a way to kind of create that ongoing opportunity to network among people that are all committed to the goal of economic mobility and opportunity. I think it's been a really valuable setting because these types of informal learning networking spaces, I think, have to be part of the change that we're going to see in the organizations.
As to more,
I would like.
Yeah, jump in, please.
I just want to pipe in there really quickly and just to say the culture change part of this is really important because part of what Annelies was saying earlier is about the belonging. And I think that you can have somebody who, let's say that they acquire the skill set, but if you put them in a culture in which they're not valued or it's clear that they don't belong, it's not going to work. And so the commitment by companies, companies have to not only be willing to say, okay, look, this person has something in their background or this person has a history that is different than what we would normally hire for. But then once the individual gets there, there has to be a way to create a sense of belonging. Otherwise, again, people are going to leave, whether that's around just racial and ethnic or gender diversity or skill set or life experience, people will leave. And so it's a larger commitment. It's more than just recruitment. It's the retention part of this is also about belonging.
Yeah, we have these really alarming stats, just to your point, William, about belonging. We have these really alarming stats about 1 million women leaving the workforce just in the month of September, largely because of, school starting back up, but then not having that social safety net of public education, which is kind of one of the remaining equalizers or a safety net for mothers and parents in the United States, right? And so that holistic idea in your final slide, Annelies, I think is really important. Orlando and Allyson, I'd like to hear your vantage point on how well or not well the business community and academia are working together to sort of not only help create opportunities, but also upskill where necessary. Orlando, do you want to take it first?
Yeah, I'll tell you, some universities are doing it extremely well. But based on my observations, in some cases, they're doing it extremely well because they were given the opportunity much earlier in the process. And so I'll give you a couple examples. Within the CSU, the California State University System, San Francisco State, then San Jose State. If you look at the type of employers that typically kind of literally hang out at San Jose State, they differ. And these are some of the same companies who have locations in San Francisco, because San Jose State has had a much larger opportunity much earlier in the process. So some are doing it extremely well, some are not.
What could be done better, Allyson, in terms of the partnership between schools and the private sector?
Yeah, so I guess my journey and experience here is, you know, I lead a V-team that looks at community college connections, opportunities, bringing skilling opportunities, but also talking with faculty members, especially STEM, computer science, about what challenges are they facing. And especially at the community college in that arena, they're just incredibly pressed for time, feeling very overburdened by the kinds of needs that the institution's giving them, and then also the kinds of needs the students have, et cetera. So one thing that we've done is helped some community colleges apply for more federal funding to help up, you know, if let's say a cluster of community college faculty members want to have a more effective or timely computer science curriculum, they shouldn't have to do that all by themselves. They should be able to bind together and apply for additional funding, but sometimes they simply are just struggling with time. So we have been helping with the grant writing. With HBCUs, we've been providing some grant funding there. We've also been talking more directly with students to find out what kinds of needs are they facing through the curriculum, but then also in terms of recruitment and feeling like there's connection and belonging and social systems in place. So I think part of what the private sector can do better is go in and listen, and then meet the universities, community colleges, whatever the context is for higher learning, post-secondary, meet them where they are and help wherever they want to go, which is sometimes a different mindset than maybe historically what companies have done in the past.
Orlando's talking, but I think you're muted.
I was hoping I would never do that today. But if I could just round this out, you're absolutely correct, Allyson. I'll give you two primary examples, not because they're on the phone with us, but Microsoft. We've worked now for the last couple of years with Microsoft. Last year, pre-COVID, it was the internship program. This year, it became, because of COVID, they quickly pivoted, and it became the mentorship program. And so we had 9 students from San Francisco State partnered up with mentors within Microsoft for a 5-week program. The students partnered up and they had to present projects that I can tell you right now, some of them actually have real go-to-market opportunities. And so it works. Another example was last week, and these are more custom approaches, right? Is literally asking companies and organizations to change their agenda, right? Change the way you've been doing business. Don't be afraid to pivot. Another example was last Thursday, we had a robust panel discussion with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. Typically for their gold internship program, it's a highly regarded program. They post it, they ask students to apply. But we changed it this year, and we had 8 panelists from the Federal Reserve to participate in a panel discussion with the students. The energy behind that was phenomenal. And from an application standpoint, those internships that they posted, there was an exponential effect positively on the number of students who applied to those internships, because now they could hear, it was a conversation. They could now believe that this indeed is an opportunity for me. And in some cases, it was changing of the students' minds to look at one opportunity versus another, and not based on so much their major, but where their opportunity exists.
Fantastic, thank you. Tom, I want to jump back to you to ask what you think is missing. So we've talked a lot today just about how we're going through this historic digital transformation at the same time that there's all these other factors going on, right? But in the programs that are being offered either from academia or from the private sector, in order to make sure that digital skills and digital literacy is there for potential employees, what do you think is missing in the programs or from what's being offered?
Well, I think we have people on this panel that are far closer to answering that, but I'll certainly give that a shot. So when I think about the conversation, which is phenomenal, of the other panelists, I'll go back to what Allyson was talking about on the great efforts Microsoft is making in combination with others to really start looking at digital skills. I'd pull back and I guess pose a question, which is, why is it that people reach a certain part of their life and only then are we introducing them to certain things? So I'm an advisor to some of the largest health and medical organizations in the country, and increasingly health and social organizations are looking at what's known as social determinants of health. What are all these variables that determine someone's health and well-being? I think there's something similar here to contemplate, which is, are there such things as digital determinants of health or self-sufficiency? Why is it that certain people from the beginning of their lives, this is just pervasive in their lives, and why is it that others are not exposed to it ever, or not until later in life, where a lot of the opportunity to have those natural skills could have been developed? So beyond that, I'd also say there's been some of the conversation around opportunity and people, and I find myself, as I was listening to Annelies talking about this theory of growth mindset, where there's a theory of some people believe they have the skills they have, and that's just the way it is, and they can't change, and yet others very much believe and try and practice a growth mindset, which I think is behavioral. I don't think you come from the factory one way or the other. And many times, I think it's a matter of how do we help people understand with proper guidance the ability to say they can grow, they can do other things. But I always find that people, when they look at technology, there's some that say, that's just not for me. And some of that to me is mindset. It's not capabilities. It's things that I think we could control or influence and do so at a much earlier age than what we seem to be doing today.
This is a great opportunity for, go ahead, jump in. I was about to jump to you, William, just to tee you up. A couple things. Just one more housekeeping note, just a reminder to please go ahead and ask questions in the meeting chat for our panelists, and because we're going to switch to Q&A and questions from you in about 5 to 10 minutes. And then also, while I run to get a charger, I hate to be a terrible host, but I don't want to lose my laptop power before the Q&A is out. So William, let me just tee you up and I will keep listening for this question about sustainable employment, right? Because I guess this is two parts. One is, not only do people come to you sometimes for their first job, but it's beyond just a first job, right? It's also a foundation for the rest of their career. So how do you think about that, like as being a real part, a real building block in somebody's future career? Because ideally they're graduating from Goodwill, they're not working for Goodwill forever, or they're climbing up in the ranks, right? And then two, as you talk about belonging and culture fit, what are the things that you like to see in a good company culture that do foster that sense of belonging for folks, so that workers do find meaning in their work, but also believe that they have a seat at the table? And I'm not abandoning you. I'm still listening.
Okay, no, all good. I think one of a very important thing is to recognize that people aren't going to go from homelessness or incarceration to Microsoft in one step, right? There are multiple steps that you have to go through. And I think to Tom's points earlier, I mean, what part of what we've done at Goodwill is we have instituted a growth mindset. So we worked with a bunch of folks from Stanford because what we realized is people were coming in and they were saying, I'm not smart enough, I can't do this, because that is what they had been told. The education system failed them, and that's what they believed. And when we started instituting the growth mindset, what we found is that people's minds shifted and they were like, well, maybe I can do this. And that opened the door for other possibilities. So I think that the step piece of that is very important. I think there's an employment infrastructure for low-income and extremely low-income individuals that are really important. They're called employment social enterprises. Goodwill is one of those. But there are also some of the small businesses. And if we destroy the employment infrastructure for low-income populations, people are never going to be able to take the steps to get to the types of jobs that we're talking about. So it's going to be important to preserve that as well. But I think paid work experience in a real life employment environment, on-the-job training, one-on-one support, ongoing career advising are all things that are really important. And I'll be honest with you, like some of the folks who come to us, and we have lots of different types of people who come to us, but a lot of folks who come to us, so like sometimes we have to say, well, you know what, the way that you handle interpersonal conflict in prison is not the same way you can handle interpersonal conflict in a workplace. And it's a learned thing, right? So so all of those things are really important. The other thing is our partnership with Microsoft has been amazing, right? I mean, Microsoft, not only through the LinkedIn Learning and sort of those types of trainings that we're able to offer people, but through the Microsoft Makerspace and other things. And we've seen folks go from, I'm not good at technology, to now they're in six-figure jobs, and we are starting to diversify the tech world with people who not only racially and gender-wise, but also just from lived experience. So I think there's a lot of different ways to approach this, but I think that those are some of the things. I think that, oh my God, your second question.
It's about culture change and what you've seen or what you recommend that really works to make sure that people feel like they have meaning and belonging at work.
So, I mean, one of the things when I got to Goodwill, I mean, there were a lot of things that needed to be changed. But one of the things that we had like 7 different values, right? We have 3 values now, and it's safety, learning, and belonging. That's it. And that encompasses everything that we do. And belonging is such an important piece of this. And I sort of touched upon that earlier. But I mean, culture change doesn't happen in a vacuum or in a boardroom. It actually has to include everybody. And I think employees need to see and feel the efforts to believe and embrace them, right? So if I think putting individuals with non-traditional experience, and I kind of hate that because I think that what it just means is that we're not valuing the broad breadth of experience that people bring, but putting individuals with lived experience in positions of authority and leadership is critical to demonstrating the authenticity of equitable practices. Companies need to reflect deeply on their core identity. And I think a lot of what happens is companies are focused on being competitive, and they don't recognize that actually you can increase your competitive edge through that diversity of experience and knowledge. And I can just say, yeah, so I mean, I think those are some of the things that folks can do, but it really takes the organization to really be willing to look deeply and to say, what are we doing? Because I think in a lot of situations, we talk about diversity. When I got to Goodwill, there were some diversity issues. We're now 75% people of color from entry level all the way through executive leadership. So and people are like, well, how do you do that? And it's like, well, it's actually not that hard. And it's about who the environment that you create, but it's also who how you treat people, and whether people feel like they belong, right? And so, but it requires people to truly self-reflect and to truly shift. Businesses have to shift their own mindsets about how they operate if this is going to fundamentally work.
That's fantastic. And I see, Annelies, you want to jump in there. So Annelies, why don't I give you kind of the last word before we jump into some questions from the audience. An audience, just a reminder to please type in your questions because we are leaving about 10 to 15 minutes for you.
Yeah, so I'll try to be quick. That really resonates with me, and I wanted to give an example. So I did a panel over the summer, you know, as COVID was unfolding, there was a huge crisis within prisons, and we did 2 webinars around the COVID crisis in prisons. One was on the health issues and prisons themselves, and the other was on reintegrating people after they were released. One of our guests, you know, it was really notable that she said that, so she participated in several programs, like several different organizations worked with her both inside and then on the outside after she came back out. It took an entire ecosystem of people, but she got a job within the tech sector. And she said, you know, it wasn't my skills that I had to prove to get this job. It was I had to know people within this company who could vouch for me when I applied. And so I think, you know, one of the things that people miss, you know, when you have a record, oftentimes people just dismiss you outright. And it doesn't matter if you have all the right skills, if you have that record. I think that's another thing that employers could do better, especially given this racial equity problem that we have right now, that's like staring us in the face with COVID and with the protests this summer over the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So we really need to look at how when we just dismiss a whole pool of people, we're missing talent. And so I just want to emphasize that part of what made it possible for her to get those networks is that individuals from tech companies at different levels were taking the time to volunteer within different community programs, whether it was in, you know, within San Quentin and other facilities, or outside, you know, like Code Tenderloin and things like that. So I think, you know, individuals can make a difference by just having that initial like face-to-face opportunity to meet people. And then the second point I wanted to make was something that Tom was saying regarding healthcare careers. So when I showed that chart of public sector trainings, a lot of them are in healthcare. And we also found in our analysis of earnings after WIOA, which is the workforce legislation, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, that the huge wage disparities between Black women and Asian men. So Black women were earning about 60% of Asian men, and that was largely because of the occupational segregation in healthcare careers. So I think in order to, like, one thing is we need to, you know, prevent it or keep learning in the workplace, but there are problems when a lot of these entry-level jobs that we're shoveling people into with public dollars pay very low wages and have unstable hours and are not really setting people up for career success. So in order to address that problem, I think we need to move from a model where we're just doing these one-off things and letting people go. But we're really working with partners regionally to make sure that that person who does get a CNA training can step from that into the next thing. We understand by doing some interviews and work with them directly, what is preventing you from taking this next step and then trying to build in the solution. I think we need to work much more holistically on that. So.
Thank you so much.
Oh, I was just going to make a fine point on the belonging piece, which is, I definitely think it starts early. And I think everybody in this whole discussion would probably agree with me in that, you know, we've been really working hard to expand computer science education to every single student in the country. And only 4 out of 10 high schools really offer it right now, which is shocking. But at Microsoft, we bring in students to do hour of code and exposure and all of that. And what's been fascinating for me, based in DC, going out to community centers and schools and just getting students engaged with technology was seeing how young it starts of this belief that I can't do that. I can use my phone, but some students, I think, almost perceived it as magical. And when you broke it down and they engaged and they could see that they could code, immediately you could see this, not only a confidence go up, but a sense of, oh, I can do that too, and belonging. And I think we need to be there every single step of the way, all the way through adulthood, but sending those messages very young.
And
Fantastic.
I just also want to say, the other thing just about the public sector is that I'm seeing in San Francisco, I know Josh Arce is part of his responsibilities to head workforce development here in the city of San Francisco, and they're really shifting the way that we look at this. And it's one of the things that I really appreciate about the city and county of San Francisco is sort of the ways that they're pushing the envelope and trying to look at innovative ways to move this forward. And not all governments do that, and it's something that I appreciate.
Fantastic. Allyson, just real quick, a question from Brian in the audience. Is there a goal job transitions you expect to facilitate with the $50 million investment? What is the objective in terms of number of job transitions?
So the 25 million people we're trying to skill up, it's more about people who are gaining skills in course completions. The amount of money that we're focused on nonprofits, we're looking at wraparound services and support into transitions into employment. It's really hard to measure who gets a job and where. It's just like sort of trying to measure, a high school student who graduates from high school and trying to predict 4 years from now where they'll land, college, no college. Tracking someone, then it goes into they have to self-select into the system because of privacy issues. And so we have to be very careful about how we think about working with employers and the potential employee who actually get a job. So we take a step back and try to influence and measure what it is we think we can measure.
Fantastic, thank you. This seems like a pretty broad question. I don't know who is best to answer this because it's not directed at any specific panelists, but the question is this: what supportive services are being offered for underserved communities? And in this case, he's talking specifically about older adults or people with disabilities. And so what sort of supportive services are being offered for those who might face stigma in hiring?
Well, I can speak a little bit to the older adults. We do have a program, actually it's more rurally focused, but for National 4-H and Microsoft, we have this partnership where we get youth to engage with elderly folks, people who are learning how to use technologies. So they may feel very, very disconnected and think, again, counting themselves out of certain kinds of jobs, and maybe don't have, it's not as easy for them to get to the library or the job center or whatever the case may be to get the training. And yet youth in the community will come into the community center or the senior center. And so it creates a rapport, a connection, and, students can be enthusiastic and disarming and make an elderly person feel like, wow, I can do this in a different way. I can maybe start to sell online in ways that I never thought I could. And so it's been really, again, a great education all the way around.
Fantastic. Okay, next question is from Annie. She would love to learn about any case management models that have been paired alongside the Microsoft, LinkedIn, GitHub Skills Initiative to help people stay engaged in online learning and ultimately find employment. And she also says, thank you, this is a fabulous panel.
So we launched the program June 30th, and we're getting our best practices. I can share a couple of them with you. We have a manufacturer based in Wisconsin who has decided to take different parts of the curriculum and upskill, so in particular the data science curriculum, and they took a swath of their employees and said, okay, we're going to have all of you go through this curriculum, the data science piece, and we're going to then keep you as a cohort and keep you supported as you then attempt to go for different kinds of jobs. So that's been interesting in that to see employers or sometimes nonprofit folks zero in on a certain set of courses and then support folks over time into better jobs or other jobs. We've also had some case examples where it's more of sort of it's not a boot camp model per se, but it's a deep dive. Come and skill with us with this content for 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and we're then also going to take 4 weeks to help you with job transitions. So we're collecting those, and we'll be sharing those best practices and stories as we continue on this path.
Okay, fantastic. All right, we have a few more minutes. A question from Melody. Is the public sector looking at ways to be more innovative in how they're helping working moms, either in training or helping individuals who want to work as child care providers to start small businesses, or in just supporting the moms themselves, I assume? Annelies, have you seen anything policy-wise, I guess, besides the stimulus money?
Not federally, unfortunately. I think we need to do a lot more in that area, but locally, I'm familiar with, there's an organization called ESEPS, Early Career and Education Pathways to Success, that is creating a childcare apprenticeship program, and that's, I think it's based in Oakland. So that's one of the more innovative programs that I have seen. I think in general, we're not going to solve the COVID equity problem until we find a solution for childcare. I think it's really, and a lot of childcare providers have gone out of business. And so, this program that I mentioned, ESEPS in Oakland, I think is one of the national leader, like one of the few national programs across the nation that have started to really think about how to resupply that childcare. But that's why I kind of wanted to call them out. But I think it's dire, and especially for women. Women are leaving the workforce to be able to care for children.
Yeah, I'm actually writing this down because it might be an interesting story to take a look, to take a deeper look at that program and what examples it's setting. All right, another question we have is from Annie, and she talks about how we can't underestimate how powerful the Microsoft Mentor Program is and how important that is on your resume, but also just having that network to help vouch for you, because we talked about how important having somebody vouch for you is, right? So how can we encourage more companies to host shorter term engagements like that, shorter term sort of exposure experiences? Because she says, I know sometimes we can get stuck in logistic land, HR hurdles, access, given remote work.
On campus, we have a platform. It's by a company called People Grove, but we've rebranded it Gator Connect. And it's a mentoring platform, peer-to-peer coaching, et cetera. And one of the modules within the platform itself is the opportunity that an individual, a company, an organization can come in and they can actually post micro projects, micro internships. It doesn't have to be what we consider traditional. And so what we're finding is that there are a lot of people who really want to connect with talent, right? In my office, I say we're the office where opportunity and talent connects. And our talent being our students and our alums, the connections, the opportunity being companies, organizations. And so within that platform, you can join the platform as a mentor, but you can also join the platform and present projects. And again, those projects can be literally anywhere from a week to 2 weeks to 3 weeks, however you design the projects. And so what we see is that instead of staying with the status quo, we are pivoting, but also encouraging our partners to do the same thing so that these opportunities will do what I talked about earlier. They will keep those students connected, engaged, and of course, once those two are taken care of, they'll also be encouraged.
We're also working with about 400, we work with about 400 Bay Area employers, and we are constantly working with folks on opportunities like that as well for our folks, just so that there are some shorter term, give people we've done that with community colleges as well, but just give people a taste of what that feels like, the employer a sense of, okay, what is this like? And it winds up being a win-win for everybody.
I guess my 2 cents here is,
all right. Oh, nope, you're good.
Nope.
You're all good.
just the San Francisco Chamber, got to applaud them for hosting this again. And I do think chambers of commerce across the country can, stand up and say, spending time convening employers to simply have networking opportunities for all kinds of people who would never think about coming to a Chamber of Commerce event, just standing up and saying it's important, leadership in this space is important, let's do more of it, and measuring it. And maybe even having a recognition program of employers in your community who do it well and do it often. Like, there are little things that can make a big difference when smaller or medium-sized companies are trying to figure out, do we spend our time on this kind of work? I have to say, at a huge company, we're super fortunate. We have leaders who constantly are saying how important it is to talk with folks, and we have a mentorship program. And if I volunteer my time to a nonprofit in any capacity and I track it, the company contributes to that nonprofit $25 per hour of my time, right? So that's wonderful. But what I try to do is go across the country and say to state and medium and small chambers, let's stand together and get more companies to do this and give them some recognition so that they see that value loop, other than just as the right thing to do. There's also a business loop too, and the chambers can help in that way. So thank you, San Francisco Chamber.
Yes.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you to the San Francisco Chamber and Rodney specifically, but also to Microsoft for all the work that you have been doing, and Brookings Institution and Annelies for your presentation that really formed a linchpin of this really dynamic conversation and panel. Panelists, you were fantastic. I learned so much from each of you, and I'm coming away from this really inspired. Just getting to drive the conversation has been a real privilege. And audience, you guys have been awesome. You've really hung in there. This is one of the longer Zoom calls that I'm sure is part of your day, but y'all have been really engaged in the chat, and I thank you all so much, and a huge thanks. I think we don't get to see her again. So I want to also thank Celeste, our leader, for convening all of us. You saw her at the top of this. So thanks again to all of you.
You.
Cheers.
All right, be well, be healthy.
Thanks, you too. Thank you so much for great hosting.
Happy to do it. Happy to do it. All right. So are there any instructions for how we close this out? Should we just hang up, or will this I guess, will the session kind of end since it's a recorded one? I just want to make sure I do this smoothly.
So I just stopped recording.